we disconnect them from something really valuable in human lives, is sharing of knowledge and
Right.
using knowledge to survive in our communities, this sort of thing.
It'd be fine. God
Okay.
bless it, sir. Thank you for coming.
Of course.
So you have a really interesting relationship with education that
Yeah.
I really appreciate. When I was growing up in California, education was essentially like you go to elementary, middle, high school, then you attempt to get into college for no actual discernible reason, right?
Yeah.
Like you're
It's
just
just this
you're
expectation.
thousand expectation. I have a good friend who had to get a degree. He got a degree in like sociology, gives zero squats about it, but he knew he's like, look, I want to go into sales and they're going to require that I have this undergrad. So he spent 4 years and a dump truck of money getting this degree in sociology from one of the UCs. And he's like, I mean, the degree is actually useless
Yeah.
because I was going into sales anyway. They just require this. But that hasn't been your experience with education.
No, education to me means, I think, a lot more than that. And I think, sometimes I hear stories like that. And I mean, this is my world. I'm steeped in education. I'm a teacher. I research education. I've experienced all sorts of weird education, that sort of thing. But something I always find interesting about this expectation of just going into college education just to get the piece of paper, because
Right.
the reality is that a lot of places in our world just require that piece of paper, is it just totally undermines who we are before 18, right? Like, we can't learn those skills that whatever this piece of paper is supposed to be communicating, we can't learn those before 18. So there's something special at 18 when we're out of high school, that now we can actually go into a university and pick up something that we couldn't have done before. And that just never really strikes me as real. Like, I don't know what that special thing is. I do think there is something special that happens in university, but it's not these, communication skills that you were likely going to pick it up working in sales anyways.
Right.
Like, you're going to figure out how to write and talk to diverse audiences. You don't need the university for that, right? Time organization, or, just personal organization. Oftentimes it gets touted in college and university that these are skills that you get taught through this process. Like, I know plenty of people out there that have great organization and time management skills that never went to university. It can't be the only place that that's taught. It's like, it is something special. Something special is happening in university, I think. But it's a mistake to think that what that is something that can't be taught in K through 12.
Okay. So there's a big push that I think the United States is experiencing, a wave of skepticism towards investing in higher education. You, as a university professor, and look, I helped kids get into college my entire education career, almost 20 years. And I very much appreciate my college education, but there's now this cynicism, and not unjustifiably, right? There's a real cynicism and questioning of value, monetary and otherwise, of going to college. Like, what do you think that is?
Oh, I think that's an onion that you peel back the layers. I mean, I think, one, it's a response to some a specific history that I think needs to be understood, right? That the university system was never meant for everybody. I think we're trying to be more equitable in saying that actually everyone should have access to this thing, but for a very long time, it was not meant for everybody, which meant that some people got access to this, that propelled them forward, put them in positions of power, and then they made decisions for others. And everyone that didn't go to university, those communities that weren't able to access that, and I'm talking about, low income. I'm talking about anyone that's, 25 or older. I'm talking about people of color and marginalized communities. And, like, there's a lot of communities that were not allowed into the elite universities,
Right.
Or to the system. I think we're seeing a history of that. A lot of those communities, and a lot of it is rural, right? The rural communities have been extracted for urban benefit for a very long time. You can look at healthcare differences, education differences. You can look at suicide rate differences. It's just across the board. They've been extracted from, it's not just rural communities, but they've been extracted from, and they've been precluded from being a part of this institution, the higher education institution. And now in this history, we've got this, like, hey, you're not for everybody. institution. Not everybody can go. You're not representing everybody. What are you doing here in our modern contemporary world? I think it's that first layer is just this kind of cultural pushback that just comes out of this history, that there's been haves and have-nots, and the university has helped reinforce some of that for a long time. Now, I think it goes much, much deeper. I mean, I think the university has, well, we have to remember that the current university has only existed the way it has for about 150 years. Prior to that, it was something entirely different. There was some legislation passed in the 1800s. I think Lincoln passed it. That changed what the university is. And this is where the land grants came from and that sort of thing. But it became this kind of functional workforce role. Like, how do we train people to participate in an industrializing society? And an industrializing society required evidence and facts and a sort of science and research that we have seen over the last 150 years. But the university before that wasn't doing that. But when you start saying, here's what knowledge is, here's what truth is, here's what sort of measurements and data represent this, here's the process by which you find it, what you're doing in essence is you're saying who's allowed to define their world and who's not.
Right.
Right. And I'm not suggesting science has done an intentionally bad job at defining the world. Right. But what's happened is this institution has utilized things like knowledge that are extremely human and personal. Everyone has knowledge. I don't care if you've ever been to school a lick in your life, right? You have some knowledge. But when we start defining what knowledge is, what good knowledge is, what bad knowledge is, how to find it, what sort of data is able to justify knowledge, and then we say it takes this big, price tag to become, credentialed in the knowledge system, we leave a lot of people out, and we disconnect them from something really valuable in human lives, is sharing of knowledge and using knowledge to survive in our communities, this sort of thing. And I think this role of knowledge is going unarticulated in these current kind of conversations.
This podcast is brought to you by MTU Studios. If you're looking to start a podcast or need content for your business or personal use, content of any type, please reach out to MTU Studios. MTUstudios.com. We'd love to help. Yeah, and there's an implicit understanding and agreement with you. For instance, a good friend of mine, dear friend of mine, got his MBA from USC. And I'm like, hey, Carl, first, congratulations. Second, I thought you didn't finish undergrad. He had a major car accident. He was halfway through, I think, Santa Barbara. And he's like, yeah, I didn't. Like, you just graduated from this with this MBA. He's like, I know. They substituted 10 years of work experience for my undergrad. And then he very successfully went through this MBA program, like Carl kicks ass, right?
Yeah.
So there's an implicit agreement with what you're saying, that like the knowledge that you gain in a university setting is not unique or wholly owned by that. It could be also replicated or predictably, the skill sets you gain in that could be predictably gained through years of work experience. And of course you have to apply, you have to have a certain aptitude and whatnot. But everybody knows, it's kind of like, okay, yeah, you can go to undergrad, and as the old adage goes, education is wasted on the young. It's one of those things where the cost, the juice, and the squeeze and the pain involved from a financial standpoint and from a lack of world experience. You have people going 4 and 5 years for their undergrad, more so now as budget cuts reduce the number of available courses that people can take. But it's like, dude, you just lost 4 to 5 years of your life. You better have something that's so astronomically valuable when you leave. And like, again, I am not against higher education. It's one of those things. Before I forget, you mentioned extraction. I've heard you talk about this before. Extraction from rural communities.
Yeah.
I was listening to a portion of a lecture the other day that was talking about allowing the best and the brightest, right? The H-1B visa, right? Allowing the best and the brightest people from other countries, be them, first world countries all the way down to third world countries, to come in and enrich our communities. And then specifically take away the first world countries and just say, look, the immigrants that can come in with educations or not, are the most energized, are the ones that are most intolerant of the situation that they were coming from, all of these things. And we let them come in, right? And bully for us, because now we get, workforce, we get, and again, I'm not talking about illegal immigrants, but I'm talking about people that go through the process, and we cherry pick. We take the best. The speaker was talking about this and said, look, essentially what we're doing, we're not helping the third world country. No. We're not helping the world at all. Because like if we let in 1 million of the best and brightest from the most impoverished, horrible condition countries, right? Third world countries, what we've essentially done is drained away the people that would have been the catalyst for change in these countries. They would have been the ones that pushed for better living conditions, better work conditions, for better opportunities for their young. But instead, we just open the doors, cherry pick the ones we want, close the doors, and then the community, the third world country is left without the intelligent, capable people that would have been catalysts for change.
Yeah.
Same thing happens in rural communities.
Absolutely. I mean, sometimes it gets called brain drain, and we're draining the brains of it. I think that's true. Everything we just talked about. I think it is more complex though, because I don't want to get the idea that by the best and the brightest coming into, let's say, university or coming into America, that they can never go back. Right now, often they don't. Like we don't educate them in a way that we don't have programming in a way that really makes it obvious how they can go back. I think, talking before you and I think it brought up, that like, if you get a degree in robotics, it's not obvious that a dairy is a big robot, right? But if that's told to you and you understand robotics through thinking of a dairy, now you have a pathway to go back to your community. And there's nothing wrong, I think, inherently with that, right? Like go get an education, get this like really world-class education to really propel you into a different way. But the education system needs to be as such that it shows pathways back to your community. It's never a bad thing to leave, right? And it should be a possibility to come back. It's a bad thing to leave and having no possibility to come back. Right. That's where the damage gets done. We need that sort of diversity of thought, right? Go somewhere else, learn something else, come back and teach us so that we can adapt and evolve to changing circumstances as we move through. That's wonderful.
Right. And there's always, there's a classic criticism. It's like, oh, well, people just aren't intelligent where I came from. Well, it's not like none of them were.
Yeah.
Like maybe you were there, you had the same population of intelligent people as anywhere else. They either couldn't find representation or an outlet for it, or they just left. And again, they didn't come back. And that's such an unfortunate thing. And like the other thing that you said that's really notable is I grew up in like middle class kind of area in Northern California. Not a great spot, but fine. I survived. Bad education system. I think my high school that I went to had the statistic was of the highest socioeconomic group coming out of my high school. They were 8% college ready, right? 8%. So it was lower than the worst schools in Compton. That's the school I went to. And there were about 30 kids who went through all of the top courses that they had to offer, because about 20 years prior, it actually had been a fine school, but there was a large wave of immigration and, a lot of English second learners, and that just drained the resources of the education system. And my school in particular was where they kind of just dumped all the kids that didn't. It was like 65% Hispanic and, tons of resources and stuff to kind of try to bring those people up. But the point is, getting out of there and going to college, which I really appreciated doing, was a real ticket to engage in the world in a more meaningful way. But there was never a discussion of like, oh, you're going to go back to Concord? It's like, no, I'm never going back to Concord.
Yeah, right.
And mind you, I ended up, before I moved here, I was 3 miles south of Concord. The geographic disparity was nothing. Like as a crow flies, like it was like a half mile. It was over like these foothills. So I was living in this place called Danville, which had hyper concentrated these atypical, wealthy, very successful people, and was just sucking, like you wanted out of Concord so fast and you wanted to end up in Danville. And like that's where people separated. And there was a large criticism even within that education system were the people in Concord that were upwardly mobile, that did want more for their kids, sent them to private schools. And then everybody else got left in the public school. And the criticism was, of course, if you stopped taking your kids out of the public school to put them in private school, the public schools would be better.
Yeah, we'd have more resources in order for.
And you wouldn't have 3 kids in calculus. You'd have like 20 kids in calculus. You'd have 100 kids. But like you keep poaching and taking out to these private things. But I don't see an alternative. Like the alternative of, okay, I have a very capable kid. I'm just going to send him to this less quality school to bring up the average of the school. That's not a really good answer either.
Yeah. I think these are just complex, if not wicked problems. And maybe I should say something really quick when I say complex. What I mean is to distinguish between complex and complicated. A complicated problem is one of those problems that, sure, like one person is unlikely to solve, but you get a lot of good, very smart people around the table, you'll figure out a solution. Landing on the moon is a complicated problem, but we can do it. We can solve it. A complex problem doesn't have a solution. Any solution that you bring forth is just going to cause another wave of problems that you're going to have to find solutions for. Things like climate change and education and, economic reform. I don't care what you're talking about. They're complex problems. You can't solve them. And so let's just earmark that, because I think it's incredibly important to remember that education itself is a complex problem.
Right.
And anyone that says, I have the solution, is all they're saying is, I have a solution that's creating another set of problems that I have yet to think through what the solution to those are. And I think that's what you're just, commenting on, is that, a solution is to, put our kids in these schools to raise the averages, right? And now here's the other set of problems that comes out of that.
Right. And it's, again, on a larger level, you can apply it to like, well, the solution for intelligent people, or rather capable people, cognizant people that have a capacity for higher education, or say robotics, the solution is not necessarily keeping them in the rural community.
Yeah.
Like, help them get out, help them engage deeply in the thing that they're most interested in. But again, as you keep saying, like, there should be a path back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think it's, the solution that I'll bring forth to a complex problem, knowing that there's other problems that are going to arise out of it. I think that solution starts in the education system itself. Now, we need help, right? Like, a rural school that's struggling to keep teachers on board, they can't think about how to educate differently their kids until they've got some help to just get teachers there and paid a decent wage so that they can stay there and live in that community, right? Let me just put that out there. But once that has been met, I think it's incumbent on us. I don't want to put this on the student or the community that we're taking the student from. It's incumbent on us to develop better programs and better education models that allow students to see themselves inside the really awesome, complex problem space of robotics or philosophy or whatever they're interested in, right? And see how that it's our responsibility to foster those students to envision how that can help them in their community, develop some relationships instead of this. I don't know how I want to communicate this, because I'm having a hard time here. I also love higher education. I really do. I think there's something vitally important with it. And I don't want to be seen as like attacking higher education. I do think there's some issues. And one of these, I think, is this kind of predominance to have an answer. Like, we teach solutions, and we don't do it in a way that I think is often obvious. It's not like we're saying, you come in with a problem, I've got the solution because I'm the professor. But think of even testing. Testing gives this idea that there's a right answer. And I'm not suggesting that there's not things that aren't right answers to, right? Sure, what's 2 + 2? Well,
sure,
it's 4.
Sure.
That's the right answer. But if that's all we do, if all we do is test and we make people think that there is right answers, right? I think what we're doing is we're removing that sort of innovative curiosity that fosters this kind of individual self-determination to think how what they're learning applies to their world. And it may not apply to everyone's world the same way. I guess what I'm arguing for is more of a education informality instead of an education formality. And I see this play out in a lot of different ways. If we wanted an economy full of workers that were all the same, I run a factory. I don't need 100 individual thinkers. I need 100 people that doing the same thing.
Right.
Right. Now I'm oversimplifying a large economy, but if that's the case, then I need an education system that's testing so that everyone comes out the exact same.
Right.
Right. In this kind of quantitative measure and metric. If I want a highly flexible, adaptable community that can manage be resilient in an age of flux, right? I actually want intellectual diversity. I want 100 people thinking differently about things. I want 100 people thinking, reading through things and interpreting them different and understanding how they're seeing the world and in their experience, how that thing plays out. Because when I have them, and I also want civil discourse, I should say that. When I have all of that, right? When something happens to this community, someone's going to have this kind of novel thought that helps us organize in a way. But if we're all the same, if we're all thinking the same, we're very rigid. It's hard for us to adapt and evolve to changing pressures. And I think this, like I'm kind of going off on some weird tangents here, but I think this kind of formalization of our education system has done this in a sense. Like we treat students more like products, right? And
1,000%. We've commoditized student debt. It's the most secure debt for any financial institution in the world. You have to die out of it, and even if you die, I believe it gets passed on. Like you can't get out of it.
Yeah, you can't. It does not get erased in bankruptcy, right?
No. Like, it's like you can buy a car
back, but I cannot take your education.
You can have the house. Well, here's the thing. Interesting. I think everybody should just start paying for their education with their credit card, right? Like you can have all kinds of debt and be able to bankrupt and get out of it. And I'm talking like you could take a trip to Europe. You could, buy all kinds of jewelry and give it away. You could do all kinds of things, get into crazy debt, and then it gets wiped clean in bankruptcy. But the education is the one thing that you will never get. Funny enough, the shift in how student debt is handled coincides with an absolute skyrocketing cost of college. Why? Because institutions were willing to loan more money for people to go to school because they're like, hey, double it. Like I'm a bank. I have $1 billion to loan it. I got to make the best, most secure interest on this ever. If I was loaning people $25,000 for their undergraduate before, make it 100. Yeah. Because they will be our indentured servants for life.
I don't think that's exactly wrong.
Maybe there wasn't a guy in a bank saying that exactly, but it was close. It was close to what he said.
I mean, also we've lost public support of higher ed, right?
Okay.
Like tuition has been rising, and I've got complex feelings about this as well, but tuition has been rising, and part of that is because to cover the cost when there's no more public support coming in, or there's not no more, but there's less public support, tuition has to rise. There's not much in the way of incoming funding into these universities. Yeah. And then that gets borne by the students. They pull out more loans. I think it is more than just the bank. Now, the banks definitely are okay with loaning more.
But I mean, a couple things. So first off, you talk about imagination and the capacity to find solutions to complex or however you want to describe the problem, right? I guarantee you, if people couldn't get loans, the cost of college education, university education, would be less. Now, you would probably have fewer things involved. You wouldn't have giant stadiums. You wouldn't have the same rec center. You wouldn't have the same high quality dormitory accommodations. You wouldn't have a lot of other things. But there would be a certain percentage of people that figured out a way to get a certain amount of money, and the universities providing that education would have to figure out how to make that money work, right? Like UC Berkeley built on the backing of the UC Regents that oversee the UC system. They built a $500 million stadium. And I have a very good friend, Max, who, we met at Cal, and he was incensed. He's like, I can't believe this. Like, here California is just in a hole. UC Berkeley is losing credibility, becoming more of a federal institution because it's being funded by the federal government more than the state government. And they build a $500 million stadium under the guise of like, it will improve our attendance because more people want to come to football games. He's like, what the shit is this? Okay. But my other question is do you think that one of the reasons that some degree of public sentiment has wandered away from public education, especially higher education, is because there's no longer a correlation between the utility of the education and the cost of the education, right? And there's also a cultural shift too, right? Like, for instance, my brother doesn't graduate from high school, right? But then he's incredibly bright. Again, kind of grew up in a rougher area. We had a rough family life, but he decides when he's 20, he's like, I'm going to go back to school. Like, great, Mike, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
So he goes back to school, gets his GED, then goes to a city college. California, by the way, has an incredible junior college system.
Yes,
like, they're just dying to get people in school. And the county I grew up in, you can go to JC essentially for free for 2 years after you graduate high school. It's wild. It's like $1 a unit or absolutely free. Anyway, the point is he ends up going to UCLA, then goes to Princeton for his PhD in computational neuroscience. Okay. Bright guy, very bright guy. He became such a dick when he went to higher education, and he totally captured how you described the concept of knowledge, meaning no longer could you talk to him about the reality of his world versus your world. He now owned the capacity to define our arguments, our world, how we viewed things. If we disagreed on something, it became, well, you can't actually think that, so you must be mad at me for something else because I'm obviously right here and you have to work out why you're not agreeing with me.
Yeah.
Right? So it became this thing where it's like, dude, what are you doing? Like, this is nonsense. So again, this cultural clash and loss of correlation between like, wait, we the public are funding this thing. Like, why are they, like, the people coming out of it do not seem to be, one, very skilled, and two, really they don't really see the average person just working through the world in the same way that they used to, I guess. It's difficult to, I'm having a hard time articulating that.
It feels elitist at times, right? And I mean, I don't disagree. I'm caught in this kind of weird spot. Right?
I know you are, which is why I'm enjoying this conversation.
It's interesting. Two things I want to say is, one, I want to be careful. I think there's two things happening here. One is the value for undergraduates. That's something that we should talk about. And then the other is what's happening with faculty, right? And I think those are two maybe related conversations. But for undergraduates, I want to talk about that one first. And I think this one goes pretty quick. I like to think about the university as a gym. Tuition doesn't guarantee that you're going to get stronger.
Right. Just like the membership ain't getting you on the treadmill.
Right. It's like it gives you access to tools and trainers, right? And gives you access to, the things that are pretty specialized and highly specialized and can do you really cool things in the world. But you have to use the equipment, right? And if you don't use the equipment, well, there you go. How much did you pay to have a gym membership so you can have a fob on your keychain for the next 4 years, or a sticker on a Boise State sticker on your SUV or whatever it is, right?
Right. Attendance does not guarantee even learning, even if you started going to the gym. You're just not.
And I see it all the time in my students. Like, I think those students that take it seriously, that they're paying for something and they are going to learn, and they engage and they talk to their professors, and they try to get internships, and they work in labs, and they do, those students that really take it seriously, what they're doing there, I think they do get their value out. A $40,000, God, I hate to think it's a $40,000 student loan debt for an undergraduate, but even if that's the case, I think over the long term of their life, they've got that value out, because they do come out, they hit the ground running, and they're the ones that now are, they are running things. They're managers. It's the ones that just assume that by going, right. And I don't blame the student. I blame society. We've kind of got this idea that you just go sit in the dorm, drink some beer, meet some people. 4 years later, cheat on a test or two. 4 years later, you're going to get a piece of paper and that's your golden ticket to the world. And then they're realizing, wow, how much student loans do I have? And I didn't see any value. It's like, yeah, you bought a gym membership and you never used the equipment. And I think it's incumbent on us in the university to think how to better engage our students. I think part of that is through the curriculum we teach and the internships we offer and the way we do research. Sure. I mean, there's a lot of moving parts there. I think it's also just a general culture, and it's not just the university. I think we see it in a lot of places where, people aren't wanting to work the full 8 hours anymore. And I don't disagree necessarily, but our ideas of work-life balance are changing. We are going through a cultural shift where if the value isn't obvious, I don't know that I want to put in the time. And this gets to the second point about faculty. I think faculty, like some of the most wonderful, intelligent people I know are faculty. I mean, they've been trained. They've spent years thinking and sharpening those skills, right? I absolutely love them. I think we are often, and I'm faculty myself, I think I am often responding to a community or a society in a lot of the conversations I have where our society needs to deeply reflect what knowledge means and what higher education means in our contemporary society. And I don't mean like, what is the role of education? I mean, it's just an institution. What does Google mean in our society? Right? What does Tyson Chicken mean for our society? What does Shell or Chevron? What does Jack in the Box? What does In-N-Out Burger? What do these things mean? How do we want to integrate these things into our society? Higher education just has this weird relationship that we've existed for 800 years, right? We're kind of this quasi-government, like we are part of government. We're part of state government, or at least my institution, Boise State University. But we don't have like a regulatory policy-making role in the way that like Idaho Fish and Game does, something like that. I think we need to really just take a step back and like, what do we mean by higher education anymore? Right? What do we mean by this institution? We're having to exist in an institution that has, 800 years of history. Not all of it good. In fact, a lot of it's pretty bad. That has engaged, and I think oftentimes currently does engage in this sort of extractive practice that we were talking about, brain drain. But they're good people, that they care, and like my colleagues care about students so much, it's ridiculous. And myself, I care about students. I want them to succeed. But we're caught in a system that is just so weird and broken because we've commodified education. We've commodified the degree. We've commodified the student, right? We want the same student. Well, we don't, but I think society wants the same student.
Right. And there's also there's not continuity between how students are treated, even between universities. For instance, Boise State is not a crazy research facility that's predominantly focusing on its graduate students and its graduate programs and its research because it's trying to get patents and trying to get grants and things like that. Berkeley is, right? Like, and so at Berkeley, I went in as a math major, love math. And you realize that it's like, oh, no one actually cares about the undergrads. Like, you are literally just a loaf of bread on the shelf, and they're bringing you through, and there are grad students there that are required to do a certain amount of work with you just as part of their like tuition reimbursement or the program or whatever it is. Like, they have to teach you. This professor up there, he's not going to turn away from the board. He's going to keep writing and speaking in monotone. No interest in you as a student or a person or what's going on. It's just that he's required to teach this course to go back to his research. And once I realized that kind of later, like, that's why it seemed so sterile and transactional.
Yeah.
You know, once I left the math department and I found rhetoric where I was really deep, I went from these like 1 to 300 person classes down to like 15 to 30. And the professor's right there. And they would be deeply engaged and arguing with students, which I thought was crazy. There's like in math, there's no back and forth, but in rhetoric, it was all persuasive language and argument. So a student would say something, the professor who was badass would be like, push that down. And like you'd go back and forth, and it wasn't a confrontational thing. It was like, this is what you do. Like you have to use language. You have to think deeply about these things.
Yeah.
And if you bring a B- game to the table today, this is what's going to happen, right?
Yeah.
And it was such a beautiful, cool thing of engagement because there's not a big research aspect or like a commoditized aspect to the rhetoric department. It's like, no, we're just here to like teach you. Like if I'm teaching rhetoric, I'm into actually teaching you.
Yeah.
If I'm teaching math, I just need to get back to my research, right?
That
was it. So again, you have universities like Boise State where you're saying, hey, look, the faculty deeply care about their students. And it's like, yeah. And I think that's unique to that university and some universities like it. UC Santa Barbara is another one.
Yeah.
Where they were very committed to their undergraduates, whereas UC Berkeley was not, right? So when people are concerned about this, sometimes I really advocate for, hey, look at the university as a whole and what you want to get out of it. And that will tell you how they're going to view you to a certain degree.
Of course.
Right.
Yeah. And you're right to point out that, there's a difference between what's called an R1 institution. R1 institutions are those heavy research focused institutions, an R2 institution, a liberal arts college, a community college, a land grant institution. These are all institutions, the higher ed institutions that have different priorities, and find one that meets your needs, right? That's a really great piece of advice. And some of them, and this is just where my bias is, that I think that sort of rhetoric class that you were talking about, that's, I think, what education should be more of. And I have to struggle with this a little because I also recognize we live in a world where I want to make sure if you have a degree in building bridges that you know how to build a bridge.
Right.
Right. Like, let's be honest about
and get
this.
the best dude there.
Yeah.
Or gal, whatever.
Yeah. It's like, I get that. But also we have missed something about education if we are not engaging in that sort of what you described with rhetoric. And this is a lot of my classes. Well, I'm a philosopher, so my classes are very similar to this, where we're engaging in this kind of back and forth discussion that's kind of on the brink of an argument. Like, are we right? Are we wrong? I'm not telling who's right. I'm not telling who's wrong. But what I'm trying to do is model this sort of civil discourse. We're learning throughout it. We're engaged. We're wanting to be here, and we're thinking deeply about something. I don't know what else there is to education outside of that, right?
Right.
And it doesn't have to be all the one or the other. It's like, sure, we need math classes, and I need to know that 2 + 2 = 4. So you're going to go build a bridge. But maybe it doesn't have to all be that. Right. Maybe if it was half of that and the other half was this like deeply engaged critical thinking, we'd see more value out of our university systems.
Right. And the irony, of course, is that you have people that are these intermediaries for people that deeply understand the bridge, but they can't communicate at all. I was doing a couple of years back, I was helping this real estate company because I happen to know real estate pretty well, and I happen to know content really well. And some people would argue that I have capacity to communicate complex things in a short period of time. So they're like, we need you to make content. And there were these real estate guys, super techie, had this app. The app was super cool, but it was literally like a Ferrari with every bell, whistle thing. And they had just focused on building this incredible machine, but could not communicate the utility or value or even how to drive it to the average person. So I had to make, knowing what I knew about what they were doing and being creative, I'm like, if you hit this and you hit that and you try that one, check this out. They were like, oh my God, like they had never even thought of it, and they had designed the machine, but they couldn't articulate the value. So it's like when you were talking about, hey, maybe we should have, like, let's make 80% of your engineering degree, 2 + 2 = 4. Wonderful. But you need to be able to communicate a little bit too. Like you're going to rob yourself of the capacity to, one, advocate for yourself in an employment situation, and two, you're not going to have as much value to the team if you lack communication skills that'll allow you to talk to, management and tech and all those things. One, what was I going to say? Value of liberal arts. Okay. Now, this is
Yeah.
a hot topic
Yeah, oh, it is a hot
in
one.
higher education. It's so clear that the 1+1 = 2 makes sense to everyone. They're like, we need more engineers, we need more doctors, we need
Yeah,
more
STEM
whatever,
education.
STEM education.
Yeah.
Right. The whole bit, right? The value of liberal arts is not immediately understood to the average person, but we all engage in behaviors and decisions that could be enriched by the thinking that's intended to come out of liberal arts, not the decisions that are intended to come out,
Yeah.
but the mechanisms that we use to determine. For instance, there's a bill on libraries. I'm not interested in getting into the bill on libraries,
Fair
but
enough,
the point
yeah.
is, there are two bills. One bill attempts to set standards through a state level, and the other bill and again, they do a lot of different things, but the other one is like, hey, this should be left on a local level. We have to deeply consider philosophically, what do we want from our government? Is what we want from our government actually being represented in practical terms in these bills? What are the principles that these are engaging in?
Yeah.
And then somehow navigate the complex contradictions that arise from it's like, okay, well, this one is bigger state, but it's this, and then this one is smaller state, but it's that. It's like, what do we do? That's a liberal arts
That's exactly
question.
right. Yeah. Yeah. It's, I teach environmental studies, and a lot of my classes are about the environment, and particularly environmental issues here in Idaho. And at the beginning of most of my classes, I say, hey, I just want to tell you all, I promise you one thing. Every environmental issue we are facing as a human species in our entire world is not an issue of the environment. It's a human issue. Every one of them. Right now, we have enough information, we have enough science to likely recover the salmon to the best of our ability if we really, really wanted to.
Right. If we wanted to.
If we really, really wanted to, and we could just like wave magic wands and just do the things that needed to be done, right? Restoring stream banks, doing something about the dams, ocean conditions.
Finding different transportation routes for grain, producing power in a different
all
way.
That stuff, right?
Finding different hatcheries for the ones that came up from the dams. Sure, the whole thing.
It's like, another $250,000 to research the adipose fin on a certain subspecies of salmon is not likely going to recover the salmon. And it's possible that we find some magic bullet that, recovers it. But the reality is it's a people issue. If we can understand people and really try to understand what salmon means to different people and the trade-offs that people are making decisions and bring people into the solution space instead of making them feel like we're making solutions and putting them on them. And that's all humanities, right? Mm-hmm. Humanities, it's in the word, it's human. Humanities is not saying we know what humans are. It's saying humans are this complicated, weird being that as soon as they know that they're being studied, change their behavior so that your studies are out, right? Humanities is about how we interpret the world, how we live in the world, how we find meaning in the world, the language that we use to articulate it. And that language is the only way that we can communicate with each other, right? And what does that mean? It may seem like fluffy stuff around the edges, but in reality, that's the stuff that matters. All that other stuff we can learn when we need it. For instance, here in the West right now, and in the Intermountain West, I'm sure most of our land is federally held, federally managed. Nevada is something like 94%. Idaho is like 64% federally managed land. So the federal agencies, predominantly the Bureau of Land Management and the U.S. Forest Service, have a really high presence here in the Intermountain West and in a lot of our communities that are working on timber and ranching on those lands. Now, there's a big push right now for those agencies to be more responsive to community and integrate and communicate and collaborate with rural communities more and more, to kind of on the realization that there's not a lot of capacity. We all need to work together to work on these lands. And I've talked with so many agency members across over the years, and they say, what we need is someone that can talk to people, not another biologist. Right? It's easier for me to teach someone that knows how to talk to and communicate with people in diverse, intense, and conflict-ridden situations. It's easier for me to train that person, the biology, than it is to train the biologist how to do that. And that's what comes out of liberal arts. That is not easy. And especially in a society that we have that is so conflict diverse, we do not like conflict. right? It's that old,
We like to watch it on Instagram, though.
yeah. I mean, we like it at a distance, right? But
Yeah,
it's like
yeah.
that old, don't talk about politics or religion on
Right.
your first date. It's like, why not? Like, those are the sorts of conversations that probably should be having on
Right.
a first date,
Right.
right?
Right.
But we are just so averse to these kind of ideological conflicts. And there's reasons out there that I'm not really certain of, but those are the sorts of things that those are the data sets that humanities work with, those conflict sets, like how we're interpreting the world, where the conflict come from. If we train that, then we can figure out the biology. We can figure out how to build a bridge, right? I'm not saying that's easy. By no means. That is
Sure.
expertise well beyond me, right? But at the very least, there needs to be a balance, I should say, at the very least.
Don't you think that at least part of the reason people are incapable of talking about politics or talking about, religion, things of this nature, is because people have lost the capacity to disentangle themselves from their core beliefs, and not like, if I'm Catholic, I stop being Catholic for a portion of a conversation. It's like, no, I can be Catholic and still engage in a meaningful conversation with somebody who's not, and not like flip out at them.
Yeah.
Like the ability to suspend your emotional anxiety throughout a conversation, all of a sudden it's like, it doesn't exist anymore. Like people get like, to your point, how hard is it to talk to a wide variety of people? I did interviews with every person save two that were running for mayor of Eagle, city council, board of education. I got everybody in the board of education, all 8 people, fire commissioner, all of these different people. Lots of a wide variety of different thoughts and solutions and philosophies, principles, the whole thing. And I was able to sit down and talk to them, not argue with them, and like understand what they're doing. And it was so novel to people. When in reality, I just sat down and like, tell me what you think.
Yeah.
Like it doesn't, for the person, I think for the people that can communicate to a wide variety, a wide spectrum, right? It's kind of like, yeah, but this is, like, you just don't get upset. Like you say something I don't agree with. I'm not like mad at you. Maybe I just don't agree with you. Like, and maybe I'm just not going to write that on my face. I'm just going to hold it on in, right? It's okay.
Yeah.
But for a lot of people, it's not like that. It's like they get so worked up over what someone's saying, and then they rally against the humanities too. It's you don't get people who can keep their cool and detach from emotionally from ideas and talk, successfully through complex things and say we should all be engineers.
Yeah.
Like those two things don't get to go in the same thing.
We have, we have a really hard time holding contradiction. We are such multifaceted beings. There's very few people we live in a black and white world, or at least we assume it's black and white. You're either this or you're that, right? Think of political parties, right?
Oh yeah.
And we know the data is out there that most people in the US actually fall well within the middle.
Right.
Most people. It is not black and white for most people. And there's almost no one that's purely one side or the other. But we have this idea that if you believe this, then you believe all of these other things. Like, well, no, I can believe that and that. Right. Like, oh, no, it's black and white. And this collapsing the dichotomy, like we have to choose a side. I think it makes it really hard to have these conversations, but that's exactly where the humanities dwell.
Right.
Right. Because the humanities understand, and going back to like how we can just sit here and have a conversation with someone maybe we don't agree with, right? That what you're saying, not you particularly, but when I'm talking to someone, when I'm hearing something that just I don't even understand. I don't know to agree or disagree with it. I just don't get it. The person saying that, I have to trust is saying that with some fidelity to who they are.
Sure.
They're not just making stuff up, right? They're saying that for a reason. Maybe it's satirical, maybe it's to get a rile out of me, maybe it's because they just truly believe it. But I have to first imagine that they're right. Not how they're wrong, but how they're right. How it makes sense for that person in their world with their experiences to say the things that they said. But that requires me to take seriously who they are. Try to imagine what their experiences might be. Try to imagine how they're interpreting their world. Try to imagine how what they're saying is an accurate reflection and depiction of their world. There is no right answer to that. There is no zeros and ones I could collect data wise to build a picture or a model to predict that. There's nothing. That just takes the power of the human imagination and capacity of our empathy to just put ourselves in someone else's shoes. And it doesn't mean that I have to give up my own self-identity to do it. It doesn't mean I have to be less of who I am.
Right. You don't have
To
to
try
be
to
less
understand
convicted.
why you are,
Right.
why you say the things you say or do the things you do. Now, I do want to say on top of all that, I think what really gets difficult is when like if I did something, my actions hurt someone, right? Then it might be, I think it would be all right for you to ask me like, I don't only want to understand why you did that, but I need you to stop. And if I'm like, no, I don't want to stop, then now we have a big conflict, because when I'm hurting other people, I think we have a moral reason to maybe say something more than just understanding my
Okay,
right.
but isn't this where the deep contradictions and principal conflicts come into play, right? So
Yeah.
when you're talking about like, it's hard for us to hold conflict, and like people struggle with these types of things. The most ridiculous, hilarious example was over the vaccine debate, right? Did you ever watch that guy, the comedian Awaken with JP?
I don't think so, no.
Super long red hair.
Yeah.
Like he does all this satirical stuff, but he's very, very on point with his criticisms of policy and social things going on. So one of them was like, essentially the principle of my body, my choice totally stops depending on who you're talking to and what the issue is. And he was actually on, I think that like major news organizations, he's this guy on YouTube, right? Millions of followers and stuff, but he ends up on these major news organizations being like, that's because it's not a principle. It's not an actual philosophy they have. It's just something they say to get their issue pushed across. Because my body, my choice for the pro-life people, or excuse me, pro-choice people totally went out the window when it went to vaccines, because it was like, no, it's no longer your body. So it's like you had the pro-life person and then the pro-vaccine person like going at it, both screaming, my body, my choice. He's like, because it's not a guiding principle, right? And that principle conflict is really what comes down to like, people haven't thought through the things that they need to think through to apply these principles thoroughly and exhaustively throughout their decisions.
Well, I mean, that's one way to view it. The way to view it is
polite of you.
Yeah,
that's one way to view it.
Well, but I like, and I don't know the answer, right?
Sure.
But one way to view it is that we do hold these, or we have the possibility to hold these concrete, stable principles, and we just need to be more reflective to apply them more accurately across the various situations of our life. That's not wrong to think, right? But the other way is that actually that we don't actually hold stable principles that are that can be applied.
That was the whole point of the Socratic text,
yeah.
right? Like you could never say something that would hold up over deep enough criticism and scrutiny to like escape Socrates' wrath, right?
Yeah.
Like, so you're right. You saw this representation in I don't know if you ever read or saw the show Game of Thrones, but it's like Jaime the White Cloak, right? There's this beautiful, and he's in charge of protecting the king, and he actually killed the Mad King at some point, so he was called the Kingslayer. And at some point he has this dialogue with Brienne of Tarth, who's like criticizing him because she very much values the White Cloaks, like the Secret Service.
Yeah.
And he, of course, went against the Secret Service and killed the king. And he's like, but they make you, and he's so jaded. He's like, they make you vow this and they make you promise that. You got to protect the weak, but not the weak when they're your enemy. And you have to honor this, but only when he says it. He's like, and what do we do? Right?
Yeah, right.
Like, and he's like, none of it matters because you can't actually hold a stable principle across a lifetime of humanity. It's too complex.
Yeah. And expect everyone at all times to hold that principle. Who knows?
Right.
Now that's where the really difficult part comes in. The really difficult part comes in. It's like, okay, well, what's the answer? That we have no principles? Like, well, no, we do have principles for situations and they change, right? And we need to be able to engage in civil discourse and critical thinking,
right? And,
weigh options and have conversations and just treat each other well. And I mean, this sounds like, all pie in the sky, like just treat each other well. But it's that sort of thing. Like that's actually what falls out of recognizing that not one principle can can underlie or lie at the foundation of every decision at all time. It's like we actually have to choose as a community which principles to apply at what time for various reasons, right? Like, sure, when my choice whether or not to vaccine is affecting just me, maybe this principle is fine. But when my choice whether or not to do something is actually affecting everyone around me and they don't have a choice, but my choice is affecting them, then, we think about this with DUIs, right? Like, it's like, well, my choice to do this thing is not just affecting me, right? It may affect someone else and therefore it's illegal, right? It's like these principles, and we see this all the time. These principles very rarely get, implemented fairly, or not fairly, but equivalently across society. So let's just double down on that and say we are full of contradictions and paradoxes, and we view the world differently. And the only way we really can understand how to go forward in any way that minimizes harm to me and other people that I care about is to talk through it and to be fallible in our statements, to recognize and be humble, maybe I should say, to recognize that I can have beliefs and it doesn't, being challenged doesn't challenge me as a person, right? It just means that I need to be, thinking through why I have these beliefs and respecting that other people have others. And I think, and I've seen this happen quite a bit, both in classrooms and in community collaborations, where we can be on opposite sides of an issue. And the more we just talk about it without staking positions, the more we end up just kind of agreeing, and we don't even know what we're really agreeing on, but we're like, oh yeah, I see your point and you see my point. I'm like, okay.
Wait, where was the disagreement in the first place?
Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. It's like, oh, well, now let's talk about solutions, and things just kind of fall out of that. But it turns out that it took a lot of conversation. And this goes back to the education landscape. That requires just understanding that the world is inherently fuzzy and contradictory, or the problems that we face within the world are inherently fuzzy and contradictory because they're human problems.
Right. And
there is no solid modeled answer that exists on a true false test, right? That's just a pipe dream.
Right.
That we can understand the world to such a degree. And then, take it even further back than when we structure a society based on research and knowledge and expertise and elitism and decision-making, all this stuff. And that leaves a ton of other people out. And now we are looking at higher education being this thing that we don't really know what it is or what its purpose is. Is it to, develop workforce? Is it to be innovative and develop research? Is it to help, maintain a democratic citizenry? Is it just to keep people employed? Like, I don't know. Right.
Right.
And, we're at the center of it and trying to figure that out.
It's just a swirling mess of humanity and bad beer and
yeah, right. Well, so you've been faculty before, huh? Swirling mess of humanity and bad beer.
Man, it is. And I mean, truthfully, the thing that always got me about humanities is at the end of the day, people were like, look, humanities are to help you understand not what the right way to live is, but how to conceptualize your life and come to the answer that makes sense to you. And one of the greatest shocking moments in my life was I was arguing with one of my students. I was like in my early 30s and arguing with them about the nature of lying and like why lying is bad. And I'm like, listen, you're level 1 lying, right? Level 1 lying is like you're lying and your greatest concern is that you'll get caught lying and the repercussions of that lie. I'm level 2 lying, right?
Yeah.
Level 2 lying is I shouldn't lie, not because if my wife or friends find out, they'll be mad at me and there will be repercussions, but because it will tear the fabric of my implicit understanding of what my life and relationship with these people are.
Yeah.
And then all hell breaks loose because they like can't trust me. And it was like, it was so hard for a 16-year-old to conceptualize it. Like, wait, what? It's like, because nobody relies on you.
Yeah.
You're 16.
Yeah.
Like nobody expects anything from you, but like at the point when you're leaning on people and deeply trusting that they will follow through with what they said they were going to do. And then you found out they were lying. It's like your crutches pulled out and you're like falling down into the abyss of blackness and despair.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like you have, and so it's, again, I think for me, at least, I've viewed education differently in that it's like, look, the role of the university is to make a better functioning populace. But not everybody needs the university to become better and more mature. And better is a really complex, nuanced idea, right?
Yeah.
But to some degree, we need very technical, STEM-oriented things. We're like, look, we need better iPhones. Theoretically, mine works fine, but I'm sure they'll have iPhone 20 soon.
Yeah, right.
You need better cameras that no one uses, right? Like you need all these things. Everybody wants consumerism. But then there's also this fundamental piece of attempting to convince an 18-year-old that what you're engaging them in, the discussion, may actually bear fruit when they're like 35 and confronted with a very difficult decision. And they're going to need some kind of thought training, not an answer, but training of like how to break down the problem.
Yeah.
Of multifaceted and successfully navigate it in a way that they won't regret the rest of their lives.
Yeah. I'm gonna spew out just a few things that you just made me think of throughout this. I'm gonna try to go fast, but I love this conversation.
Good.
Right?
The tea hit hard.
Yeah,
this tea, like,
that was good.
Good Lord.
One is, employers don't want someone that just solves the problem that they know they have. Right. The employer's like, I have this problem. Sure, I need this solved. And there's plenty of people that can help solve this. But when I hire someone, you know who I really want? I want someone that can tell me what the problem I don't know I have is and can figure out how to solve it. And in 10 years can continue doing that even when things are changing and adapting. That is a really difficult skill to teach. Right. But that's, I think, what university does well. Two, one thing that I want to be sure to say, given all of this stuff we've talked about in this conversation, is I think it is a mistake, and this is just my own personal perspective, to think that...
To have come on this podcast. I agree. I agree. We're going to burn the whole thing down.
Yeah, okay, we're good.
It's a mistake. I'm sorry.
No, I think it's a mistake because sometimes I even catch myself doing this. Like there's something really special about higher ed that it's a mistake that you can't get that elsewhere. Like I do think I think the liberal arts and the humanities and, for that matter, higher education itself teaches you. And I think it's an efficient way. It's, you go to one place, all of this stuff. It doesn't somehow make us better, like better humans. And you'd said this, like, the idea of better needs to be talked about. And I think you're right. It doesn't make us better humans or more human because the converse of that would be anyone who doesn't do this is less than.
No, but the goal is to improve people. This is not the only way to improve people.
Exactly.
It's one way. It's one path of improving.
Yeah. And it's actually a pretty efficient path, right? You pay some money, you go to a place, and if you take advantage of the equipment in the gym, you got a good chance at getting this improvement. Whereas you're going to have to kind of bounce back and forth and be really intentional other ways. But the last thing I want to say, and I was actually just this morning having a conversation with one of my colleagues at Boise State, Dr. Stuart Gardner, and he said this to me, and I guess this came out of a sociologist in France in the 1700s or something. He said, this guy said something to this extent, a good democracy is one that pays people to be a critic of itself. Right. And I think I've been thinking about that all day, and I'm glad that we're having this conversation. I think there's something really important about that, because if we weren't in a good democracy, we'd be fine with whatever we were told, right? But in a good democracy, we pay people to question ourselves, to say, wait, what are we doing? Are we doing it well? Are we doing it great? And maybe we don't always like that line of questioning, and maybe that line of questioning sometimes is just flat out wrong. Right. But the fact that we are so confident in our democracy that we're willing to pay people like me sitting here to even think about who we are, what the role of my own job is. Like, hell, if I do my job so well and think so well about the role of faculty in America, I might put myself out of a job, right? Like, oh, I don't actually exist anymore. Or my job shouldn't exist. I mean, that's possible. Right. But we're in a society that is so confident in democracy, and I think we should be confident in what we have, that we're willing to say, yeah, let's pay people to just poke at it. Because every time we poke at it and we figure out how to solve that thing, we just make it stronger. We make it stronger. So let's pay people to poke at it. And maybe that's the purpose of higher education, is like if we could all just be better at poking at it civilly and respectfully, right? Like actually caring about each other, we just get stronger. I mean, maybe that's just a vaccine itself, right?
Vaccine against stupidity.
Yeah.
Or a failing democracy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree
don't
with
know.
you. You have to stress test.
Yeah.
You can't look again. My education was in persuasive language, and the number one thing that taught me was how to be self-critical. I think like my wife will get mad at me because we'll be drinking coffee or something, and my head's going like 1,000, and I'm thinking through courses of action and finding holes in them myself. And it's a very strenuous process, but what's yielded at the end of the cup of coffee is something that I deeply believe. Like, look, all the information I have right now, all the outcomes, this is the best one. This is the best course of action. And
you can say why.
Right. And then applying that to a larger scale. Yeah. Like that's stress testing the system and having people that are teaching other people to stress test the system. Again, not what the answer is, but identifying different ways of thinking that yield better answers. Whatever that answer is with whatever set of problems you have, that makes a better democracy, makes a better populace, makes everything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if that's the point, if that's the role of higher education, then
then we just solve the problem.
We solve the problem. Now we need to figure out like how to structure that entire education. But that's a different level.
Listen to me. We've been talking for a while. I appreciate you. We'll have to do another one. Thank you for coming on today.
Yeah, this has been wonderful.
It's great, man. Yeah, I got to get more tea because like this stuff was wild. I have this is the most lively conversation I've had in some time. Thank you again for coming.
And
again,
you for having me on.
You are in which department at Boise State?
I'm at Boise State University in the School of Public Service and Environmental Studies.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Fantastic. I'll have to come audit one of your classes. It'll be great.
Oh, you're more than invited.
I'll heckle you from the back. Thank you, sir. I appreciate you.
Thanks, my friend.
This podcast is brought to you by MTU Studios. If you're looking to start a podcast or need content for your business or personal use, content of any type, please reach out to MTU Studios. MTUstudios.com. We'd love to help.